Remember, one of our early classes was property and the ancients. Okay, we broke from that to go and look at indigenous people because of the similarity between the ancients and the indigenous. Now we have a bit of an idea of the way that there is this commonality between indigenous people and ancient civilizations. But we left our period of history at a rather dismal moment, right? So this morning, what we're going to be doing is going through that part of Western history that runs from that dismal moment in time when Rome was falling apart and brings us through roughly about 15 or 1800 years. Well, it's probably about 1500 years, more or less to the present. We've really got two topics, and they're going to be split into this morning and this afternoon. This morning, I'm going to be doing primarily history. This afternoon, I want to be looking at the theory side of it. What was happening to the idea of property through the period we're going to be looking at today. So that's kind of how we're going to be able to break up the class today. Okay. First thing I want to do is acquaint you with the distinctions in the periods we're talking about. Very, very simple. There are three words or three terms that are common for this period between Rome and what I'm going to call modernity. And those three names are commonly rolled together as if we were talking about the same time. There are political and ideological reasons why that has been done, which perhaps we might become aware of as we go through time. But for our purposes, I would like you to be aware that these are three entirely different periods of history with completely different cultures and completely different dynamics. And it's very important to separate them. Dark Ages, Middle Ages, and the medieval, or sometimes referred to as the High Medieval period. Okay? They are not the same times. The Dark Ages runs from roughly about 500 to Christmas Day in the year 800. So, switched off. Christmas Day, the year 800. We'll get to why that happened. That was the Dark Ages. It was a time of falls in everything to do with human society. Everything was getting worse. Technology was getting worse. Food production was getting worse. Education was getting worse. Commerce and trade was getting worse. Law and order was getting worse. Civil unrest was getting worse. If you look deeply into ancient history, you find that there appear to have been more than one dark age back through human history. There appears to have been a dark age in the Greek culture, for instance, around 800 to 1000 BC. There is some evidence that there was an Egyptian dark age, also way back in the sands of time, hundreds and hundreds of years BC, perhaps a couple of thousand. And we see that also in other cultures in other parts of the world, especially, for example, in India. So Dark Ages aren't unique to Western history. At this point, we're going to start talking about Western history for the first time historically. Those of you who have done some ancient history, maybe in school, would know that when Rome fell apart, it first of all broke into two halves. The Eastern Roman Empire, which became the Byzantine Empire, which we're not going to be talking about so much, although we could, and the Western Roman Empire, which we now think of as the West or Western Europe. And a lot of the things that I'm talking about are peculiarly from the western half of the Roman Empire, so the West. So we're following through the history of the West here. The Byzantine, the Eastern Roman Empire, stayed civilized for a lot longer. It didn't have the Dark Ages we're talking about here. Its history as an empire As I say, it's kind of interesting. There are some things about its property which are actually come up in what we're covering today, but I'll just mention them as we go along. Okay, Christmas Day 800. The political leader, Charlemagne, Charles the Great, was crowned somewhat unexpectedly by the Pope as the Emperor of the West. And that's why those periods changed, and we're going to be talking about that as we roll along. Somewhere around 1100, slightly furrier date, but still within a generation, about a human lifetime either side of the year 1100. We go from the Middle Ages to the High Middle Ages, often referred to as the medieval period. The Middle Ages and the medieval period have a lot in common. They were a kind of organic development from the Dark Ages, radically different from modernity. And we have to learn about that as we roll along. Also in this period is the rise of Islam, which is important because it organized culturally the East, Middle East, North Africa, those places where Islam took hold. And so we need to look at Islam as well and understand it, its political economy, its capacity to organize a civilization. And remember, there's a theme that I think I mentioned in our last session, that below every civilization, the foundations to every civilization, is a religious belief. Okay? Islam is a religious belief. It's a world religion, so it's got the capacity to be a worldwide religion, and therefore it has the capacity to support a civilization. Christianity does the same thing. It's a world religion, has the capacity to support a civilization. The Hindu religion and some of the other religions can be considered in that class. That's a different class of religious belief to local religions. So the animist religions that you find, we normally associate with Africa, but we find those all over the world. And there are some in the Middle East that locate themselves specifically to an individual people and tend not to be able to be scalable up to being a world religion. It has an effect on the type of civilization which is produced. So we're going to be looking at Islam in that context and what it tells us about property, and also we're going to just duck into the rest of the political economy of Islam. Some of you may have already read that because we've got about 3 readings on Islam. Okay. We mentioned briefly at the end of our class on the ancients that at the end of the Roman era, the Romans became so self-indulgent, selfish, whatever, that they were too busy having orgies, assassinating each other, stealing each other's land, that they weren't really able to support a society. The army, which is a fairly perilous occupation, tended not to be populated with Romans anymore. Basically, if you served your country in the army, you didn't get paid very well. You tended to come home and find that your land had gone. And anyway, if you're wealthy enough to be able to pull it off, you could have a far better life by getting somebody else to do it. And so we ended up with the introduction of the large mercenary element made up of what we call barbarians that came into the Roman army in particular, and eventually took over the political, military, law and order functions. And so as Rome kind of basically crumbled, it didn't fall so much. Crumbling means that you have a breaking into small parts, and those small parts tended to be organized militarily, politically, and economically around the leadership of the local Roman general, who was typically of Germanic origin, blue eyes, fair hair, and over a period of time, the locals traded their private property rights. Remember, Rome started off as a kind of communal property rights, but then sort of wafted into what we would identify as freehold. But then simply for the purposes of survival, the Roman landowners, and these are landowners that were owning large tracts of land, you know, the area of, say, a large chunk of Sydney with perhaps thousands of people as quasi-slaves operating within it. But those landowners, to save their own skins in their lifestyle, were prepared to give the formal title of their land to the local military leaders, local generals, in return for protection. I guess you see a parallel perhaps with the mafia, especially in the days when that organisation was a noble way of trying to keep law and order in a different part of time. Okay, so law and order became locally organised. The Western leaders tended to be Roman military leaders. The latifundia, which is the technical name, if you like, for the large privately owned estates, were unsustainable because they didn't have the military capacity to protect themselves, and so the title was exchanged for security. Now, over a period of time, those arrangements kind of changed gently. The previous landowners eventually became vassals, to use the terminology of feudalism, and they paid rent to the local military leaders, who eventually acquired the name of kings. And so we have the feudal order beginning in this period, in the 6th, 7th centuries. And that was a parallel to a certain extent of the tribal order that the Germans were familiar with from their tribal days. The interesting thing about it is that although they didn't use money very much, the economic wealth of the land was being paid in tribute as rent directly to we'll call them the kings, and in return they received certain benefits. The rent was not paid in money because at this stage, or by this stage, Roman money had fallen into extraordinary disrepute. The Romans started off using what a lot of people would call sound money, money based on precious metals, silver and gold. But at the height of Rome, the Roman mints, the imperial capacity to make coinage, started off as a simple way of dealing with money. You take a piece of gold, you slice it up into exactly the right size, you put the emperor's stamp on it, and you say, because the emperor's stamp on it, this is guaranteed to be a certain weight of gold, and so it has a certain value. Gold has a capacity to be natural money because gold is not easy to come by. And so the amount of toil and trouble, the amount of human effort that goes into mining gold or foraging around and finding it, means that if you see a piece of gold, you're really seeing the embodiment of a certain amount of human labour. Easy. You know, if you and I want to help each other out, let's imagine we don't have a very civilised economy, and I'm building a house and you might be doing some cooking or what have you, baking bread. I might say, well, how about if you come and help me for a couple of hours building my house, and in exchange I might give you a couple of hours of my time as a baker. Right? And that's a nice natural exchange, and it's a method of equating pricing that is very natural, and it's manifest in the use of gold or silver, any precious metal. Now, why am I telling this story? Because that's been known for yonks, precious metals, or some other thing, something which is hard to get naturally money. When the Romans became really civilized, rather than having to weigh money or weigh gold at every transaction, they came up with this idea of making it into standard sizes, stamping it with the government stamp, and everyone could say, well, that's actually, so many grains of gold, right? The Romans got a bit greedy. They discovered that, well, if you mixed a bit of some cheap metal, like copper or something, with the gold, and still put the emperor's head on it, people would still treat it like it was the old expression with the full quid, okay, had the full content. Now, nobody could do that apart from the emperor, because the emperor was minting the money. He was putting the emperor's head on, right? And so the emperor would make money that had less gold in it than what it's supposed to have. Still had the emperor's head on it, and still was officially an ounce of gold or so many grains of gold or what have you. Okay? And that kind of worked. It was a really nice little deal for the emperor because it meant that he was able to take, maybe a kilo of gold and make 2 kilos of currency. And he was able to spend it into the economy like it was 2 kilos of gold. A lot easier than working for it and sort of sending slaves off into a mine somewhere and having to dig it up. What is the modern name for that process? Starts with I. Inflation, that's right. We now are so familiar with the loss in value over time of our money that we simply manage it as a number in our economy. Back in the Roman time, it was a bit of a novelty. They didn't necessarily have the kind of experience that we had, not that I'm saying we are particularly good at it. But over time, what started to happen was that the emperor turned 1 kilo of gold into 2 kilos of money, and that sort of worked pretty well, and people got used to it. And then he turned the 2 kilos of half quality money into 10 kilos of currency. And year by year, of course, there was this kind of little game that he was playing with the people of Rome, the entire Roman Empire, until it got to the point where if a Roman tried to trade with somebody outside the empire, the Roman would come along and say, here's a coin, it's worth, 20 grains of gold. And the Arab trader would look at it and say, that's a Roman coin. You say it's got 20 grains of gold in it, might weigh 20 grains, but I know it's only got 5 grains of gold in it. If you want to trade with me, and I'm going to sell you something for 20 grains of gold, give me 20 grains of gold. See the problem? Foreign exchange problem, basically. And it got to the stage where the money was so extraordinarily denatured that it was kind of considered worthless. Yeah. You ever seen old movies where they bite coins? Yeah. There are a number of ways. Archimedes looked at, you take a quantity of what you think is a pure metal, pour it into a full vessel of water, measure the amount of water that comes out. Basically, you can calculate its density from that. And if it's not the density of gold, you haven't got a gold coin. So there are a number of things. So they were able. They were pretty shrewd. Exactly. And that's why in the Dark Ages, money was basically thrown out as a medium of exchange. Because there was so much of this fake rubbish money getting around, nobody took any account of it. Okay? And so during the Dark Ages, oddly enough, it was a time of economic adjustment. All right? Because they'd been playing with this fake money for literally centuries. Constantine, the Emperor Constantine, came into his leadership, he became emperor, partly on the platform of sorting out the money. Because Rome was in such a mess, the entire empire, Constantine introduced a form of money known as the solidus, S-O-L-I-D-U-S, solidus, okay? And the solidus, Constantine stood behind and said, this is going to be real money. Constantine, was that 4th century? came in. That was really good. Constantine didn't last forever, and the people that came after him went back to the money game, the fake money game. Okay? So he had this sort of thing going over a fair period of time in Rome. But during this period of the Dark Ages, you see, the errors, the tricks, the cheating that was kind of built into the system came home to bite the Romans. And that's why they ended up having, they couldn't have any faith in their money. They ended up not having any faith in their political order. People ended up having to scratch around and spend all their time trying to get food, and they didn't have enough time for all the rest of civilization. And of course then you had people that knew that they could get away with stealing and thieving and whatnot, and so they would do that rather than actually working. And because there wasn't a social order, they were able to get away with it. So things just got worse and worse and worse, right? But during that time, we ended up, slowly things started to get better. Now, there's a certain parallel with the beginnings of the Dark Ages and things like the global financial crisis. We have had, for about the last 500 years, a major political adjustment, depression, what have you, about once every 50 years. You can think of the Dark Ages as almost like a giant GFC. Right? It has a lot in parallel. Okay, how do we get onto that? Oh, by the way, the word solidus came right down to the present with the German word shilling. And in living memory, my memory, there are still shillings being used in certain European currencies. The British used to use shillings up until, a decade or two ago. Australian used to use pounds, shillings and pence. Okay, the shilling comes from Constantine, very ancient unit of money. However, at this period of time, still not totally over anyway, in this period of time, they didn't rely on money. Instead, rent was being paid in produce. So in other words, so much of your crop went to the local lord as rent, sometimes as manpower, and so a man may have the obligation to pay his lord 2 weeks or a month of labour. So I might be working on a farm, I might have that as my tenancy, I rent it, and I do a month or two of work for my lord, that's my rent, I don't have to pay money. Or military service, okay? So many days of military service per year. I've already mentioned diminished order and so on. Things were looking pretty grim. The Romans, in their height, were able to build reinforced concrete buildings. I may have mentioned that during this period they forgot to build. They forgot the knowledge necessary to make the cement. They couldn't even stick 2 bits of stone together because they forgot how to make mortar because they're so busy feeding themselves or starving. Now, during that time there were some other things going on. I mentioned Constantine in connection with the solidus, his attempt to try and re-civilise money in Rome. The other thing that Constantine did, the culture by and large was on its way down, was that he adopted Christianity as the official religion for Rome, and that was kind of spreading mainly amongst the lower classes, but also up into the hierarchy, at least officially, although realistically much of the hierarchy, the political leaders and so on, were too busy having a good time to consider it. Now, when the Germans took over the political leadership and to a certain extent the social leadership of Europe, they came in as totally alien to this religion that Constantine had introduced. They brought in some critical values that were really important and they was totally lacking from Rome. Rome had lost most of its cultural strength, regardless of what religion it had taken on. It had basically given up its belief in its local gods, its polytheism, Um, it had lost its family values, and so many basically sort of family values had just gone through the floor. There was very few Romans bothered to have children, and they certainly didn't bother with marriage a great deal. There were a lot of other obligations and connections that you associate with any civilization, ideas of honour, service to the country, things like that, that had all gone. The Germans had all of those values. That was based on a simple, tribal, local religion in much the same way as many of the indigenous people that we considered in our last session. And so the Germans had strong family values. They brought those from their local tribal religions. They had strong sense of honour and obligation. Again, they brought it from their traditional religions. And they had also a set of customary values that were really the foundations of a political economic order, an idea of say, property rights and so on. Now, over a period of time, the Germans, the Germanic leaders who are now the kings, adopted Christianity. I mentioned earlier that religions like tribal religions are not world religions, as opposed to, say, Islam or Christianity, which has the capacity to be a world religion. What's the difference there? When you have a tribal religion, a local religion, you have a religion that says, God made the world, He made it for my tribe, we are special because the land belongs to us, we have certain obligations, family obligations, community obligations and so on, and we also have economic customs that all come from this benevolence of the Creator Spirit, whether it's the rainbow serpent or Marlowe the octopus or what have you. With a tribal religion, though, that excludes all of the rest of humanity. And so if somebody else kind of, comes to visit, if you're in Fiji, many parts of Africa, you feel no obligation at all to treat them in any way equal to your own tribe. And the most extreme examples of that is cannibalism. Basically, I wouldn't eat my brothers and sisters and cousins, but those people over the hill who are not part of my tribe, are not part of my religion, my tribal religion, they're not really humans. They're made for my use. And so it's okay to exploit them, to enslave them, to murder them, to take their property, and so on. And so this tribal religion, the local religion, tends to have a fundamentally different anthropology, a fundamentally different understanding of what it is to be a human person. In our culture today, we have a strong idea that all humans are equal. And so we have organisations like Amnesty International that will go out of its way to get Australians or Americans or Germans or Swedes to leave home and go to some other part of the world, maybe in Africa or wherever, in Asia, and do a lot of extraordinary things to get people out of prison or to save them from torture, even though those people have got nothing to do with them, look completely different and so on. Our idea that all humans are equal is a very unusual idea in human history. I think it's a good idea. Many people and many parts of history would disagree. Slavery is an example of this, bifurcated anthropology, an anthropology which has a split down the middle, the us and the them. The existence of slavery in the United States is probably one of the most recent examples in the West of that kind of bifurcated anthropology. I'm a white fella, therefore I can own slaves, because the black fellas, they're not very smart or whatever. I mean, it's absolutely hideous and horrible, but we've done it within a couple of centuries of our time in supposedly civilized world. Okay, so they're the kind of issues that distinguish between a local religion and the civilization that comes from it, and a world religion and the civilization that comes from that. And that's what this point is making here. The tribal focus of the Germans was replaced by something that would lead to the universal dignity of humanity, to, in our time, Amnesty International. And it came through the adoption by the political leadership of Christianity. The aggressive gods of the Germans was replaced by the self-sacrificing, loving God of the Christians. Quite a different approach, quite a different anthropology. Now, with those two things in place, the basic political, cultural order that the Germans brought from their tribal backgrounds, the idea of brotherhood and so on, their strong family values, their sense of obligation to the community, weld that to the universal religion, in this case was Christianity, and you have a very powerful civilizing force. And this is what happened. The story that we saw with the decay of Rome largely had to do with the loss of those values that the Germans were bringing back in to the West. And by the time you get those two forces together, you have a re-civilization. Now I stress that because when we look at other parts of the world, re-civilization after a culture has come to bits is often very difficult. A good example of that would be South America. We have the Aztecs that were quite civilized, at least for a time. They certainly had a high culture. And to a certain extent, the subcontinent of India. The cultural peak of what India was capable of some centuries, maybe even a millennia ago, hasn't really been reproduced until very, very recently, where basically India brought in Western civilization largely on the back of the English occupation. Okay? Re-civilizing a people is very difficult. But it happened in Western Europe at this period. Gradual social change. There are a number of things about the property system that came into the West at this stage. One was the whole terminology of feudalism. To be a serf is often considered to be a quasi-slave in our thinking today. It was really very, very different. Real slavery, which is what was happening in late Rome, which was extremely oppressive, gently melted into serfdom, and the difference was that while the serfs had obligations to their lord, you know, the rents we were talking about, a certain amount of labour and so on, they also had rights. A true slave doesn't have any rights, whereas a serf had the limitation of having to live within the confines of their feudal area. So to that extent they were limited, so they weren't totally free in the way that we might decide to go and live in Canada or something. But they also had the rights that sort of started to grow up around that. They had a right to a reasonable standard of living relative to their society. And they had the right to law and order and fair treatment. Slaves don't have that. And so the serfs were a far more comfortable situation, we could say, than slaves. And so there's this gentle re-civilization that was happening through Europe. I'll just go back. At the very bottom there, you'll notice property and other rights, but with obligation. That obligation part is the key element in that line. Property rights, rights with obligation. You find that all through this story, regardless of where we look at people. When you have property rights with obligations, you have civilization. When you have property rights without obligation, you tend to have something else. Okay. This period of gentle, well, it wasn't necessarily always gentle. People were still fighting with each other and so on, because you had lots of little pocket kingdoms. They were slowly re-civilizing within their pocket kingdoms, but they tended to be still local. There wasn't the capacity really for a large political order. Okay? It wasn't like a world-sized civilization. It was still only operating largely at the level of these little tiny kingdoms. And then you have Charlemagne come along. Charlemagne, Charles the Great, was one of these feudal Middle Ages kings, but he was a bit aggressive, and he decided that he would enlarge his kingdom, basically to give his kids a better inheritance. And under his leadership, he basically went through and reunited all of these little Western kingdoms into one large empire. And as a result of that, you had one political order all through the West. Had a number of advantages, both for the economics and also for politics. It ushered in a period of relative peace. It was a lot better living in Charlemagne's Western Europe than it was before he came along, because you couldn't have people coming from one little pocket kingdom into another so easily to do bad things. It also meant that commerce was increased, because now it was a lot safer to go from one kingdom to another. You had the exchange of goods, so the merchants were able to travel further. With that expanded transport and communication between people, there was an exchange of ideas. People were travelling for education, and so we had education rising considerably. We had economics rising considerably. We had exchange of other cultural aspects. And so once Charlemagne had reunited the West, life became a lot easier. It was a lot harder for bad people to hide away, simply ride over the hill into the next country, next kingdom. They couldn't do that in Charlemagne's empire. Leads up, as I say, to for our history, for the Anglo history, 1066, we have the reunification of England. Similar advantages across England. Now, I've said a lot of nice things about this period.
Sorry, Gary. Just a quick question on Charlemagne before we move on.
Sure.
Was that the Holy Roman Empire?
Yes, that's another name for the Western Empire. That empire started with Charlemagne and went up to Franz Joseph, First World War.
Did that start generally where Germany is today?
Or the geography of it, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head, but it'd be easy for you to find. But the important thing is that he basically reunified most of Europe to the extent that you could have all of these benefits basically running across. Huh? I mean, one of the problems, you see, if we went from here up to Central Station, and they use different money, different language, and they live in law and order, it'd be pretty hard to go and buy lunch, wouldn't it? Right? Because you just couldn't do it. And if you went up there, you might be afraid that they were going to sort of, hit you over the head, and they might be afraid that you're coming to do the same thing. Right? But once you have this larger political order, humanity, it's a specialisation of labour, a lot of other advantages. Okay, what I want to do now is just look at some of the markers, some of the economic indicators that we can use, because I've said all these, flowery things about how wonderful it was. Let's look at what really happened. I've mentioned cultural and technical development. If you were to go out as a farmer in the year 800 and plough and farm an acre of land, you'd be likely to get about 300 kilos of grain off it. Okay? And that's fine. That was not quite twice the grain that you put in. You might have put in 180 kilos of grain, basically the seeds to go and plant your acre. And from that, you would get 300, and so you'd keep the 120 to, what we say, 180 to put in for next year's crop, and then you would have whatever it is, 120 to go and sort of eat and maybe use to barter to buy clothes and the other things that you might need and pay your rent. Right? That was the industrial or the agricultural productivity around the year 800 AD. You move forward by about 3 centuries, and if I put that same amount of grain into my paddock, my acre, I'd be taking off from that paddock somewhere between 600 and 900 kilos. You say, yeah, okay, it's a 2 or 3 times increase. That's pretty marvellous, okay? But by the time you look at the net increase, take off the grain that you put into the crop, remember we said in the first case, you're putting in maybe 180, maybe 200 kilos of grain into your paddock, okay? And you're taking off to eat only the 120 or so. By the time you double the gross product, you actually multiply the net, the actual profit, if you like, by a factor considerably higher. You've now got the 300 apparent increase plus the increase that you had to eat before, which is 120 or so. It's about a 300 to a 500% net increase. That's a pretty fabulous increase in agricultural productivity. We have had pretty fabulous increases in productivity in recent times by using things like artificial fertilizers, large-scale mechanisation, and a number of other things. But that increase is pretty phenomenal considering they were still using very primitive equipment. That's to the year 1100. And largely, if you're getting something like 3 times as much food coming off the same amount of farming effort, it means that you only need to have half or a third or maybe even a fifth of the number of your people in your community working on the farms, right? Because if a man in the year 800 was able to feed his family from farming his acre, now that same person is able to feed something like 3 or 5 families. And so the other handful of families are able to do stuff like go off and study, write poetry, do whatever, build infrastructure. So you had all of this economic capacity released simply because of that. If we go forward another 200 years, and okay, 200 years might seem a long time for you guys, but historically it's not a long way, that agricultural production had increased further up to about 1,300 kilos. Again, looking at the relative increase compared to the year 800, it was overall about an 800 to 900% increase. And again, it meant that you released a whole lot of your population from having to toil around in the paddocks. It meant that you're able to withstand things like adverse environmental conditions, floods and famines and so on. It means that every farmer was able to afford to live a lot better than he was that 500 years earlier. And it meant that a lot more people were able to do other things apart from dig around in the mud. Okay? And that's largely the foundation for everything else, as well as overall civilization. That level of productivity, by the way, that was achieved by the year 1300, this is still the high medieval period, that rate of increase was not exceeded until the 18th century, some years later. And behind that, you had commerce and culture developing. Okay, So by the time you get to about the year, certainly around the year 1100, you had people with a higher standard of living and a lot more free time. And that meant that you're able to do a lot more civilized stuff. Around 1100 came a chap by the name of Anselm of Canterbury. And Anselm was a monk. Had a bit of spare time because he was a monk and because he lived in what was relatively a high standard of living period of history. And he sat and he thought and he thought and he sat. And he looked around his world and he saw that it was orderly. He could see that day followed night, summer followed winter. He could see that chickens always came out of eggs. Right? There was this sort of order in civilization. And he thought to himself, that's interesting. He was a Christian monk. So he says to himself, I am noticing that in creation, everything that's made by God, there is order. That means that the origin, the maker of the world must be orderly, must be reasonable. It's not like a bad dream where just things turn into other stuff. Right? If the creator of the world is orderly, skipping a few steps in his thinking, he concluded that he must be infinitely orderly and always orderly. Then Anselm came back, and that helped the monks understand God a lot better. It was the combination of faith and reason. But then he did the full circle, and he said, well, I can see order here and there. I can see little rabbits turning into big rabbits. I can see chickens coming out of eggs. I can see places where, order is happening. Now, if all of this is made by an orderly being, then everything that orderly being makes will have order. Even the order I'm not aware of at present. And so in a sense, I can confidently guess that in my world, if I don't understand something, the least I can know is that I don't understand such and such, but I know it will be orderly. I know it will follow rules of laws, of repeatability and so on. And so Anselm, while he was a monk trying to understand God better, actually introduced to the West a very curious idea that since then has been the basis of probably the most important innovation and distinguishing element in Western civilization that normally we would not associate with religion at all. Can anyone suggest what that might be? Science. That's right. All of our science comes from this theological insight, because without the coordination, if you like, of an orderly creator, I wouldn't know whether the next day is going to be like the last day. And if I wanted to work out electricity or quantum physics or chemistry or anatomy or astronomy, I wouldn't know what was actually holding the stars in place, because it might be different tomorrow than today. Now you might say, oh, that's really stupid. Of course it's going to be the same. But it's because in our culture, we all think like Anselm. Largely, it changed the way of thinking in the community a long way from the randomness of magic and of simply finding stuff as it is and accepting it as it is, to being able to do science where you do a few observations here, you extract from those observations universal laws, or at least hypotheses, and then I apply them over there. And then I might go out and be able to do a whole lot of stuff with these hypotheses, maybe build rocket ships and whatnot. Sometimes, when I do that building, I discover I'm not quite right. And usually what that means is, because I believe in order, that I'm able to then take those hypotheses and make better hypotheses that are able to help me do other things, like build nuclear power plants or what have you. And that's largely the story of what happened as we went from Newtonian physics which is applying order to the universe using a relatively small number of fairly simple equations, which has helped us considerably over the last 300 or 400 years. And that gave us a tremendous amount of order from a very small number of observations, apples falling out of trees and that sort of stuff, into the 19th and 20th century, where we took Newtonian physics and said, they're not quite working everywhere. There might be a bit more to that. And we took the limited insights of Newton and we put it into quantum physics and all the rest of it that enabled us to conquer the atom, basically, and a lot of other things. Okay? That's the way science works. Where does science start? St Anselm of Canterbury. At this point, the West started to pull ahead massively in terms of science and technology. It's one of the reasons why the West distinguishes itself in terms of its scientific achievements. Certainly, it's picked up a few science ideas from other parts of the world, sort of gunpowder from China and a couple of bits and pieces here and there. But our capacity to, again, build rocket ships and nuclear energy and all that sort of stuff is uniquely an achievement of the West. Okay? Right down to the extent that when the terrorists decided to blow up a couple of public buildings over the United States a few years ago, what did they use? Not homegrown Middle Eastern technology. It was basically Western airplanes. Who could build them? Only the West. Comes because of our attachment to science, which goes all the way back down to these civilizing influences. Very important little piece of history. From that time, we had civilization leaping ahead in leaps and bounds. Certainly through the 12th and 13th centuries, 14th century to a certain extent. By the time you get to the 15th century, people are getting a little bit fat and lazy, and we'll get to that as we go along. But we did have this immense improvement, standard of living, economics, culture, and so on, through this high Middle Ages. So it's one of the reasons why we tag the High Middle Ages as starting at 1100, about the time when Anselm of Canterbury was talking about the reasonableness of God and its applications to the world. Finishes at 1500 with a chap by the name of Machiavelli. Okay, we've looked at the grain production. It's the first point there. Other researchers into the history of economic behaviour have seen that between the years 1100 and 1300, income per capita, this is not necessarily agricultural, increased by a factor of somewhere between 5 and 8 times. Okay, so we've seen what was happening with agricultural productivity, the technological agricultural productivity, but we're also seeing it reflected also in the income per capita. Now, with this higher level of civilization, higher level of science, technology, higher level of culture in general, we had the resources, the human resources and the intellectual resources to develop secondary industries. So our production was able to go from cottage industries. I would live on a farm and I would, my family would basically produce all the food we needed, weave all the clothes we needed, build all the houses we needed. Okay? As we're going through here, we're able to produce specialised crafts. So you had people who were able to do nothing more than make shoes, nothing more than make clothes. There was even people who did nothing but make gloves all day. Okay? And all of these specialised trades. And as a result of that, you had these people who were specialising, and as a result, they were able to do their jobs really, really well. And they did it with a high standard of high standard of quality. and it basically sort of contributed to the improvement in the standard of living. Because of this level of civilization, money was being reintroduced. And so there was the confidence to be able to use standard money rather than simply weighing up, lumps of gold and so on. Now, the standard use of money actually was a bit of a two-edged sword. The problem with using money is that denaturing problem sort of comes in again. That's kind of another topic. We won't have enough time to go into it in too much detail, but we do find that denaturing of money also an issue. We've already seen that property and land was held under a feudal tenure. In the medieval era, commerce was largely dominated by a concept known as the just price. We find the idea of just price in Roman times. In Roman law, they had a concept, it was sort of fairly primitive concept of just price. The idea of the just price was that the value of a thing, we're talking about the glovers, right? If I make gloves, I know what a good quality glove is, probably better if I'm a glover than maybe you do, because you might be a cobbler. You might understand good shoes from bad shoes. I don't, right? Now, if you have to understand gloves really, really well in order to buy a pair, you have to waste an awful lot of your time, which would be better spent by being a better cobbler, right? If you live in a community which has a strong, tribal sense of brotherhood, where you have this sense that you have an obligation to the person that you're selling to, not to rip them off, you also have an awareness that you have a right to a standard of living appropriate to your contribution to the community. What it means is that if I want to sell you my gloves, right, I'm thinking to myself, you're my brother. I want to give you a good pair of gloves because I treat you like my brother, right? I expect that because you're my brother, you won't mind giving me enough money to be able to pay for the time that it took me to make those at an hourly rate, if you like, sufficient to be able to, pay for, putting beans on the table, feeding the kids, putting clothes on their back and that sort of stuff. You get the idea? So it means that there's this social understanding of what a fair price is. It's not simply supply and demand where I go along and say, hey, you really need sort of a new pair of gloves because yours are worn out and are coming into winter. And I think, you're really hungry and there's no other glovers in town, right? I'm not working my price on the basis of your need. I'm basing on primarily on what I've put into the gloves, right? No more. That's basically the background, the idea of a just price. It means that price is worked out largely by the seller. We have an institution, or an artifact, I guess is probably more precise, today in the West, which is relatively rare in other parts of the world, which comes from this medieval just price principle. Can anyone guess what it might be? What's that? Trade unions? Unfortunately not. What's that? Yeah, a minimum wage is actually part of it, but you go over to buy lunch, okay, today, and you'll notice little things attached to every item that's in the shop. Used to be pieces of paper with numbers on it. Price tags. Now, the Western habit of price tags is spilt over into other parts of the world. But when I was your age, I hate saying that. And I was sort of travelling around through Asia, India, Nepal, Afghanistan, places like that. You'd never go into a shop and find a price tag. In fact, most of the time, if you went in to buy something, you had sort of a 10-minute argy-bargy to go and sort of, work out a price. Because it was supply and demand, and they'd look at you and say, oh, you're a visitor from the other part of the world, you've got a lot of money. And I'm thinking, you're trying to rip me off. Whether it was, I don't know, a little cup of tea or sort of a new coat, no price tags, right? And the reason is that in most of the world, prices worked out, through an argument. Whereas in Western Europe, price was worked out because the seller knew what the thing was worth, because they were specialists. They knew it took me, half a day to make a set of gloves. Half a day of my labour, work out the hourly rate, done, right? Put a price tag on it. And so if someone came in who was your, second cousin, or if it was the king himself, the price tag was there. This set of gloves is worth, 3 silver pieces or whatever it is. Yep. That's an excellent question. Hold that question. I would say that while it appears to be, in a perfectly competitive market situation, it is. But how often do you find a perfectly competitive market situation? Right? Do you really think that when you pay for your Vodafone SIM card, you're getting a fair deal? Right? Maybe you sort of go with someone else. Huh? Yeah. Question? Okay. Now we've been going for about an hour, so maybe what we might do. Do you want to finish this slide, or we just take a 10-minute break and come back? 10-minute drive? What's that? Finish it? Okay, fair enough. The just price notion is both familiar, but it's also unfamiliar. But it's extraordinarily big. And as someone mentioned, things like minimum wages and so on also is leftovers from that idea. Manufacturing in the medieval period was done within guilds. Okay, to make my gloves, I would have to be a glover, right? Somebody else could make gloves, but they wouldn't sell them. Okay, I might make a pair of gloves for myself, or you might make a pair of gloves for yourself. That's fine. But to be recognised as a craftsman, you would have to actually be, a part of a guild. Now, guilds, to a certain extent, look a bit like trade unions today. I would say that they look far more like what professional associations were maybe 40 or 50 years ago, before professionals went into the game of advertising and competing with each other and undercutting each other the way that too many members of the API and a number of other professional association or members do. Okay? In the days when professionals, you simply went along and said, yes, I want to go along to a surgeon, I want to go along to a property valuer, or I want to go along to a land surveyor or an engineer, and the engineer or the surveyor or the valuer or whatever would simply say, this is the price. Okay? That was close to the guilds. And the reason was it was considered unprofessional to go into competition. But that's a story for another day. I think there's an article of mine, comes from 1999 if you're interested, that explores what professionalism is and how it's kind of fallen apart in recent times. My goodness, that's almost 20 years ago. Fella's been at this game for too long. Manufacturing with the guilds. Some of you may have read the reading from Nerth, Professor Nerth, on the guilds, which is really lovely. When I first read it, I thought, oh, that is too good to be true. But that entire book, it's only a little tiny book, it'll only take you an afternoon to read, gives you an idea of how manufacturing worked. But it was very civilised. The third, or maybe the fourth point in the economic institutions of this period was the moral rejection of a commercial practice which is now the cornerstone of all of our financial system. It's called usury. It is the payment, the profit, whatever, the income from a money loan. If I lend you $100, in this period of history, it was considered theft to expect back from you in 12 months' time anything more than $100. In a Christian era, that theft meant that if you did it and you didn't make some sort of reparation, you would go to hell. And people didn't like the idea of spending eternity in hell, and so they simply didn't practice usury. What that meant was that if you borrowed money, while it might be reasonable to take a little bit more to cover inflation or maybe risks, to make a profit out of a money loan was simply considered to be immoral, and it wasn't done. So we have those small number of economic principles, if you like, that were sort of the foundation. Property, which is the Aristotelian private property with common use, because remember we're stressing the idea of property rights with obligations. The obligations part is the common use from Aristotle. We have commerce under the just price, and we have the correct use of money, which is not to use it as a profit. Okay, we'll take a 10-minute break now, and we'll come back and look at what that meant for the medieval economy. Okay, great. Let's move on. What we're going to be doing is doing the debate after we finish this lecture, so we'll sort of roll straight into those. Because I know there are a couple of people that are a bit time poor. Okay, let's look at what this, how this situation, how land kind of fitted into all this. In this period in history, you had basically two major landowners. So far we've only mentioned one, which is the king. In the feudal system, you have the king as the ultimate owner of land. Under the king you will have his vassals, or his next in line. They would usually be the local lords, L-O-R-D. Okay? And under those, sometimes you'll have another intermediary, but at the very bottom of the pyramid, if you like, you had the people that actually lived in the land, worked on the land. Peasants, yeomen, sometimes serfs, basically people that are actually using the land. Okay? Above the people that use the land were the various part of the noble hierarchy in the feudal system. And those people received rent in various kinds, and then they paid rent to the next higher up. And so there were vassals within vassals within vassals, and down the bottom you had the people that were actually living on the land, renting houses, renting blocks of land, renting orchards, and so on. You also had in this system land which was not privately allocated to anybody. That land was known as the commons, C-O-M-M-O-N-S. We had the commons in our rental game. And the commons were areas of land set aside by each of the lords, available for the free use of anybody without rent. There were certain limitations on what you could do with the commons, but basically you could earn a livelihood from them. And so it provided a floor to the economy, because nobody was excluded from land. If you wanted the better land, you wanted larger land, you wanted more secure land, and so on, you would maybe rent something, but if all else fails, you go onto the commons. In addition to the land that was held by the secular powers, and also as the commons, there was also land that was owned by the religious organisations, principally by the monasteries. Now, to understand how this land ownership came to be, you have to understand what Europe looked like through this period. Largely, if you were to fly over, maybe do, the Google Earth satellite view of Europe in these days, you would see that it was mostly trees, mostly forest, right across Europe. In amongst that vast area of European forest, there were little areas here and there that were cleared, They would have villages on them. Sometimes they'd have modest-sized towns. Seldom would you find cities of the sort that you take as commonplace in Australia today. But in between all of those little villages with their areas of paddocks around them and so on, there'd be these vast areas of forest. Now, starting in about the 3rd century, or in fact earlier, there were people that didn't want to be a part of the regular society, mainly for religious reasons, who took themselves out into the wilderness, places where there weren't any people. We refer to them by a number of names. Hermits is probably a common one. And basically they would simply go away from where the people were. A place where there aren't any people is a desert. Desert is not necessarily sandy, rocky place where the sun always shines and the rain never falls. A forest is also a desert to the extent that it doesn't have any people living in it. In Australia, there's a region kind of around the New South Wales-Queensland border, a little bit in from the coast, called Bow Desert. The one thing you won't find in Bow Desert is rocks and stones and an absence of rainfall, because it's basically a semi-tropical rainforest. Very hard to live there because it's so wild and woolly, and there's a lot of things that will sting and bite and kill you. But Bow Desert is still called a desert, even though it's a rainforest, basically. So these people that wanted to go off mainly for religious reasons and be by themselves, be away from the corruption of the society and so on, they would simply go off into the forest. They'd forage around and live in caves and whatnot. Eventually, these hermits grouped together, always for the same kind of united purpose. They formed monasteries, and around the monasteries over time, they would progressively chop down the trees to go and build their buildings and cook their dinner and everything else they used timber for. Once they chopped down the trees, they had a paddock, so they were able to, keep stock and so on, maybe a couple of cows to milk or something. Over time, these escapees from civilization, the monks, would end up not just being in the forest, living in caves, but living in pretty civilized buildings, having prime agricultural land around them, which previously was forest and what have you, and it was theirs. There are a couple of other reasons why the monks ended up acquiring land. One was that over time, lay people that weren't so living like monks, would come along and there'd be a monastery there. The monastery had a number of services that were useful, things like education, healthcare, and so on. If you got sick, you'd go along to the monks because they tended to be the most educated people. So if you, they were good at medicine. So people would go along and they'd actually rent the land from the monks, the paddocks and so on that they weren't using. And so you had tenants on the monastery lands. Because of the feudal structure, one of the wrinkles in the feudal structure is that you didn't necessarily have control over the land because you had to rent it from your lord. It became a habit around this period for people to give their land to the church, usually to a monastery. Often that would come with something like life tenure, with what we'd identify with. But what it would mean is that after a generation or so, the land ended up being owned by the church. So there are basically two landowners, the secular lords and the monasteries. Both of those received rent for their land, or they used the land in some productive way. The secular lords certainly received rent. Monasteries not so much so, but they tended to do a bit. And that rent was then used for certain purposes. The rent that went to the secular lord, the lords and the king, similar to what happened, way back when all this game started, it was used primarily for defence. But as Europe became more civilised, it was also used to build infrastructure, public roads, bridges, water supplies, public buildings for different purposes and so on. And also providing domestic law and order. One of the obligations of being a king, and also an obligation of being a lord, is that you were also the local judge. And so if you had some legal dispute with somebody, okay, you would go along and have that dispute heard by your local lord. You had a right to that. You had a right to law and order as part of the fabric of civilization. When we unpack that a little bit, we can see that that comes as a result of the structure of feudalism. In addition to that, the monasteries, being particularly focused on benevolence and care for the people around them, not only did it support the monks in their life of prayer and study and so on, but the monasteries were notorious for their help of the poor. If you fell on hard times, if you broke your leg or something and you weren't able to work, usually you'd be able to go along to the nearest monastery and get some new clothes, get fed, get cared for. The relief of the poor was a large activity of the monasteries. The monasteries expanded that, especially with their education, into the provision of medical help. And so most of the people in this world that had the skills of herb law, basically pharmacology in its primitive time, and other aspects of anatomy and whatnot, was studied in the monasteries. And if you were sick, the monks would be the place to go. They were basically able to heal you. And they provided that basically free of charge. It was paid for indirectly through the fact that the monks were basically the owners of large tracts of land on which they either farmed themselves or they received rent from tenants who chose to live there. The third thing, and this is probably the biggest, is education. As the civilization of Rome fell apart, the ancient learning was largely lost in the secular world. If you or I were so busy scratching around trying to feed ourselves, we weren't going to bother too much about reading books or even keeping books. And if you go through a hard winter and you run out of firewood, would you prefer to read or burn your books to keep warm? And over a period of time, you find that you only have to burn one part of your library sort of every season, and it doesn't take more than a couple of generations because you've got no books left in the secular kind of community. And that's pretty much what happened. Education went out the window. But the monks, basically devoting themselves primarily to prayer, service of God, whatnot, saw an obligation to their fellows, to the rest of society, as preserving the ancient knowledge. And so the monasteries became centres of education, and that was sort of fairly well known. Now, because of that, they spent a fair bit of time copying their books, reading their books, learning and so on. And so the monasteries became the centres of education. The word university, in fact the whole doings of a university, comes from this era, from the monasteries. And even the clothes that we wear when you come along to graduation, you'll be basically wearing the little hat, which is derived from the medieval scholar's cap, which is derived from the monk's clothing, and the robes that we wear and so on at graduation all come from the monastic garb of this era. That education is mighty important. The education went up to university level, but also down to teaching people how to read and write. And so the kids in a local area would go along to the monks to learn to learn all the basics, whatever they needed to learn. A lot of people didn't bother with education, by the way, and the reason is that if you were so busy out there farming or doing whatever you do, even if you're a glover, who needs to read an encyclopedia? If you can feed your family, enjoy your life, learning how to make really good gloves, right? So education was something which was a specialist interest. Today we have a different view about education, but back then it worked rather well. if you can trust those people in the society who are educated to use their education for the good of the community, then not everybody has to know how to do quantum physics and fix teeth and all the other things that in our world we sort of just can't learn anyway, okay? That education was there. Now, a nice thing about all this, what paid for it all?
Church, right?
Oh, the church did the monastery part, and the secular lords did the other part, but it was basically coming all out of land rents. There was no need for income tax, GSTs, all that sort of stuff for the secular order, and in fact there was no need for money on the plates at church either. For those of you who go to church, you might find that welcome, right? Basically the monasteries are able to fund themselves by their material resources. The other thing which is curious about this, look at the list in those bottom two boxes on the right-hand side. Anyone notice something about those functions, those social activities? Yeah. They basically cover all of the major bases of what we expect our government to do today. Here they're provided by two organisations, or two institutions if you like, but they cover basically all of the functions of government, all paid for by land rent. Now some of you have already, we've talked about land tax and so on a few weeks ago and so on. So here we don't have a land tax, but we do have a system which works the same as a land tax. All based on property rights. And of course I mentioned the commons, which if you like is the third part of this. Very, very important. The commons is a very social thing because it provides a certain dignity to all people in that there's a certain sense of capacity for self-determination. Everybody can be self-employed because of the existence of the commons. Very important in that regard. It also provides a floor to wages. If I'm a glover and I wanted to employ you to come along and, I don't know, cut out my material for me, my leather or whatever, or sweep the floors or whatever I want someone to do, when I go to pay you, what level of wages can I give you? Well, if I don't pay you wages sufficient to make it worth your while working for me compared to going out and chasing rabbits on the commons, you're not going to work for me. So the commons provides a floor to wages. And as long as you've got arms and legs that work, you're able to, I don't know, chase rabbits or, herd cows or collect firewood or what have you. You're able to earn a livelihood from the commons. Last point there is important. Medieval just price. Okay, that's pretty much the dynamics of the medieval just price. Okay, cost of labour. Now you see, the just price includes these things. If I'm a glover, I might have employees working for me. I have to pay them a reasonable price, a dignified wage. I have to pay for my leather. Excuse me. My risks might be that my raw materials fail me or something. Whatever, risks. Personal income, commensurate with my status. If I'm a glover, it means I'm going to have a right to a standard of living which might be higher than somebody who is simply digging holes, but not a standard of living which is as high as the king's. I'm going to locate myself within a complex society, and my income is proportioned to that. I was talking during the break to the way that relative incomes today are totally out of whack in many ways, to the extent, actually one of the last major jobs in industry I had was down on New Parliament House. This is getting to be a long time ago, right, because I've been an academic for a while. About 1987, down on New Parliament House, and down there were labourers who were earning more than tradesmen because they were working on the hill. Today, often tradesmen are earning more than university graduates. That's a disordered society when you can get somebody on a lower level of education earning somebody more than somebody on a higher level of education and taking more risk and taking more responsibility. Okay? This idea of personal income commensurate with status, like your social location, okay, which is determined because of the education and the risks and the obligation that the responsibility you take for society. An architect should earn more than an electrician because the architect is responsible for the overall fabric of the building and how everything fits together. They're taking a larger social responsibility. I think electricians take a bit of responsibility too. I don't want to sort of come up to a PowerPoint and be electrocuted, okay? But there's a bit difference between that risk and having a building fall down because the architecture is wrong, or the civil engineering or structural engineering or something is wrong. But we've lost that. Okay, so there are 4 of the major elements to the just price. The important thing is this last 5th point, and that is that excess was considered as theft. So if I was a glover and my gloves were worth, I don't know, 10 silver pieces or something, but I knew you were really in need of gloves and in a hurry and whatnot, and you were willing to pay 15, okay? I would be selling you 10 silver pieces worth of gloves, and I'd be stealing 5 silver pieces from you. Now this is a world which had a lively belief not only in God but also in heaven and hell, and thieves went to hell. And in this world, it meant that if you were a thief, you would have to go along to confession, bless me, Father, for I have sinned. And the priest would say, your sins are absolved, now go and give the money back. And so the 15 silver pieces that I took from you to sell you your gloves, I'd have to find you and say, look mate, I overcharged you, I was only supposed to charge you 10. Here's the 5 silver pieces, please take it, otherwise I'm going to hell. Right? And if you really believe in heaven and hell, that kind of fear or concern about theft becomes a very lively organiser of your whole economy. Doesn't mean that people aren't able to get good incomes for hard work. In fact, hard work and quality production was rewarded extremely well. To the extent that if you were a good architect, or a good artist, or a good engineer, or a good glover, okay, your work was sought out because of its quality. Whereas now, we're in a world where if you make a lot of money, it's usually because of something else happening. We might talk about that a bit later on. The flip side of just price is just wages. We've already talked about that a bit. Fair day's work for fair day's pay for fair day's work. And a fair day's pay means sufficient to live in a dignified way for your contribution to society. These are choices that the society makes, and especially that the people who have economic power in the society make. Overall, they were organised or based on what a sociologist would refer to as an organic theory of society, of community. And by organic, it means that the pieces fit together like an organism. Okay? You guys have got, most of you, probably got 2 kidneys, 1 heart, da-di-da-di-da. Imagine how your body would work if you had 5 kidneys and no lungs. Right? Not very well, would it? Okay? Babies like that usually don't survive. Okay? An organism works when you've got the right amount of the right components all fitting in with each other and working for the good, basically, of the whole system. And the reason that you guys are nice and fit and healthy is because all of your parts are all in proportion, they all work well, basically for the good of the for the good of the organism. Okay? And that's the way society works. You can have other theories of society, but the organic theory is what was behind tribal peoples, the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans at the time of their cultural ascendancy, and the Christian era here through the Middle Ages and the High Middle Ages, the medieval period. you can distinguish or drill down into the just price by looking at what the different parties in the transaction actually own. Okay. If I'm going to sell my gloves to you, I come along and I own the glove. I own the raw materials in it. I have bought the labour, maybe from my employees. I have an ownership of the design of the gloves. They're the things that I own. Raw materials, design, and its labour content. You know what I don't own in the gloves? What I don't own in the gloves is whatever it is that caused you to come into my shop. If you come to buy my gloves from me, what caused you to come into my shop? When you have a break for lunch, a lot of you will sort of go chasing a coffee somewhere. What is it that causes you to go chasing the coffee? What's that? Need. That's right, desire. Okay, who owns the desire for a cup of coffee? You might be experiencing it now. You do. Does the person in the shop own your desire? The person in the shop owns the coffee. You own your need. Now let me get you to think about a very simple notion of property rights and its moral application. Is it moral to sell somebody something that they already own? Can I sell you your foot? What do you reckon? No. Can I sell you your life? It's yours already. Can I sell you your need for a cup of coffee? Okay. I shouldn't, because it's yours. I can sell you the coffee. I can sell you the labour that I've bought in making that put it in the cup. I can sell you all the things I own. But the one thing I can't sell you morally is your need. Now, if you guys just think a little bit about the way that modern commerce works, what do we spend an awful lot of time doing? Selling people their needs, selling people their desires, selling things to people that they already own. And what do we do with our advertising? We grow the desire in the other person. Advertising doesn't make the product one zot better. What it does do, though, is grow what is lurking in your purchaser's heart, mind, body, whatever. Okay? And then we go and put a nice big price tag on it. Okay, we've already talked about that. One of the curious things about the supply factors is that an accountant will be able to tell you that you can find them all in the profit and loss statement. They're all the expenses that are in the profit and loss statement. They are objective, measurable, knowable. Okay, they are fixed and they lead to the price tag. What is in the demand factors is always subjective. My need for my cup of coffee. Right? It's a bit rubbery and furry. It's not objective. And ultimately, if I price according to need, I am exploiting my market. In the culture we're talking about, in the medieval era, that exploitation was considered theft, go to hell, and so on. And people avoided it. Now you might remember that we covered some of this in our very first class. Production was organised by the guilds in this period. The guilds were self-regulated, and so today we would consider that offensive and something really dreadful. If we allowed all the glovers or all of the car manufacturers to regulate their own prices today, I think we would have a major uproar. Okay? If you let an industry do that, we would say, oh, that's really dreadful, they're going to organise a monopoly, they're going to rip us all off, we're all afraid, we'll have to get the government to do something about it. We have to rely on socialism, basically. But the guilds in this period did exactly that. They regulated the quality and price of production pretty much as a sense of obligation to the community. One of the curious things about the guilds is that because they saw themselves as an organisation, as a club, as a unity of people, they also provided other social purposes. Occasionally they would do things for society, run fairs, put on demonstrations, whatever. The most extraordinary, I find, is military service, where the guilds, if your town or your country went to war, occasionally the guilds would come along and they'd say, well, we know each other, we work with each other really, really well, we're able to work in a disciplined relationship with each other. Right now, what we love, our country, is under threat. And so the glovers will all go out as a group and they'll be sort of, on the left of the king, right? And the plumbers will be here and the cobblers will be there. And as a result of that, it's a little bit easier for the king to organise it, because he doesn't have this whole rabble that he has to organise officers and so on. He's got the leaders of the glovers, go and charge those bad guys, and all that sort of stuff.
The sellers.
Yeah. Imagine being pummeled to death by someone's shoes because they're cobblers. Now, the thing about it is that if you've got an organisation that is willing to even represent the community in military service, in other words, something which is very dangerous, you've got an idea of their sense of community purpose. One of the other advantages of the guilds is that they enabled specialist knowledge and the exchange of knowledge. There was a family analogue that worked within the guilds. You had basically three major levels within the guilds. You had the apprentices, journeymen, and the masters. The masters were the fully qualified leaders of the society. They were the custodians of quality for the guild. The apprentices, on the other hand, were the absolute juniors. They were the people that sort of came in and basically swept the floor and were learning the art. Once you got through being an apprentice, you're kind of halfway in between. Let's talk about the way that worked. When a young person was going to be entering into a guild, they were going to learn a trade, a craft, they would be apprenticed to a master, because the master was the expert. And the master would have a number of apprentices. We still have apprentices today in the building trades and so on. The apprentices were treated like children. And so a parent would go along with their child, say a father with his son, and he'd say, look, he'd sort of go up, you might be a cobbler. And I'd say, I want my son to be a cobbler. Will you take him on as an apprenticeship? And you would. Maybe you would. Okay? You would then treat that boy like a father treats his son. You would feed him, clothe him. You would discipline him when he mucked up. He developed a sense of obligation to you in the same way that a son has an obligation to a father. And you would train him in the same way that a father wants to educate his children. Okay? That would work to the point where that apprentice was up to the point where he was competent as a tradesman. Might take 3, 4, 5 years. And at that point, the master would say, look, son, he wouldn't use the word son, you're now competent. You know about as much as I do. You're a pretty reasonable craftsman. What I want you to do now is go away. And the reason I want you to do that is because I may not know everything in my trade. There might be, I'll stay with glovers, glovers in the next kingdom who are able to work with different type of leather. Maybe they're able to do different designs. Maybe they use a different approach to the stitching. I don't know. But your education won't be complete if you stay with me. I want you to go over there and learn from them. You can tell them that you're no longer an apprentice, you're a qualified person, you're worth a lot more money if you like, and in fact at that point you really don't have to learn a great deal more, but I've finished with you. The journeyman would then travel away. The advantage of the journeyman process was that the journeyman actually did technology exchange in two directions. It meant that they were able to learn the technology from over the hill, the next kingdom, what have you, but as well as that, the glover in the next kingdom had this journeyman come to him, and maybe he did the stitching in a particular way, and this journeyman sort of turns up and says, yeah, well, I sort of learned it from Small over in, Multnomah, and this is the way we do it back there. And so he'd actually be taking those methods over to the other glover as well. So there's technology exchange going both ways. Often people would stay as journeymen for all of their life. You could earn a reasonable income sufficient to keep a family and so on and live kind of fairly comfortably. The workshops, the businesses, if you like, were all owned by the masters. By the time you were a journeyman, your income was sufficient to feed a family and so on. You didn't really have to do anything more. And a lot of people stayed that way. Usually they would do their travel as a journeyman. They might find some place to settle down. By the time you're a journeyman, you might have sort of started at 12 or 15 or what have you. By the time you're a journeyman, you're probably 18 or 20. You go over the hill, excuse me, you get accepted by some master, and he might have a good-looking daughter, right? And you might sort of think, I don't want to travel anymore. This is where I want to make my family. And so you might marry there and sort of never really travel. But you may just be happy to stay as a journeyman. And a lot of journeymen would do that. And so they'd sort of settle down. So you could be a settled person who hadn't maybe travelled in years, but you'd still be called a journeyman. If you wanted to be the top of the tree, right? Sort of like the university medalist Glover. You wouldn't stay as a journeyman. You'd say, well, I want to have the independence of running my own workshop. I want to have my own apprentices. But to do that, you couldn't just be somebody who sort of decides to set up business for yourself. You had to prove yourself as one of the best in the trade. Not just a journeyman, somebody who needed to work under supervision, but somebody with the motivation and the skill and the insight and whatnot to be able to do the best work in that trade. Okay? At that point, you could go to the third level. It meant that you had to prove to the guild your quality and your ability. You had to be a person of integrity. You had to be a person who was technically top of the tree and have the other qualities necessary for the kind of leadership that was involved. You've probably all heard the expression for the example of work that a journeyman would submit in order to be considered to become a master of his craft. We use the term today. Anyone know what it is? To produce a piece of work that was suitable for you to become a master. You produced a masterpiece, right? Because that was the example, the exemplary example of your work that showed your guild that you were excellent. You were able to produce a masterpiece. And as a result of that, you were considered as a master. Marvellous thing. Some of you guys might come back and do a master's in something or other. And in the educational world, we use that term because it comes from the guilds. Yeah.
Just a question on journeyman. I was reading Kurt's reading on this, and I was a bit unclear on whether journeyman, because you made the point he could be an indefinite time. Some people might do it their whole life. Is there a level in between journeyman and master where they settle down in a place, they work under a master, but they never want to take that extra step? And is that just called a craftsman?
Well, journeyman, artisan, but you're still kind of pretty much at the journeyman level, even though you're a sedentary journeyman. But an artisan would be one of the terms that would be used. But there really wasn't a 1.5, like sort of journeyman and a half kind of level. Yeah, no, there's really just the three major distinctions. Yeah. Okay. The masters have, the family analogue would be comparable to, the patriarch. They own the businesses, they made the decisions and so on. The journeyman would be considered, maybe to go back to when we're talking about the Greeks. You remember the Greek family we started with ages ago? Okay, the adult children in the Greek patriarchy would be like that. Okay, they're people that are totally capable, but working under the authority of that unifying influence, the authority. Now, one of the things about it is, see, this is where Marxism has kind of really come in and ruined our culture. Okay, in the first couple of classes, you probably thought I was a socialist, right? Now I'm going to start bagging out socialism really big time. One of the things that we've got now is that we've got this idea that any exercise of authority is in some way an exploitation. Right? And we're all kind of influenced with that. I know I am. Okay? Here we're talking about a situation where you have an authority figure, which is a master, but the master's relationship was one of service to the guild. It's not an opportunity for exploitation. Now, you mentioned before about the trade unions. Okay, the trade unions is basically a guild corrupted by Marxist thought. Now, they were corrupted more or less before Marx came along, but if you like, the idea that Marx then crystallised into his social theory is why a trade union is fundamentally different to a professional association. Unfortunately, with the advance of cultural Marxism, we now have our professional associations beginning to look more and more like trade unions. Okay? And their relationship with society and with their own members is more Marxist conflict theory than the kind of organic theory that I'm describing here. And so the ascendancy of Marxist conflict theory is really evident in a lot of these economic institutions. And unfortunately, we all suffer as a result of it. Communism looks nice on paper, but it's an absolute dog to live in. Okay, the last one, Social Security. The guilds cared for their own members. And so if I was a glover and I went blind, or I broke a leg or something like that, my brother guildsman would care for me and my family. Okay? Didn't need Social Security. I didn't need the dole. I didn't need Centrelink. I didn't need, income insurance. Because the guild treated me in the same way that the ancient Greeks, before they went sour, would treat members of their family. And so the guild is very much a family kind of metaphor. There is an understanding, there is an understanding, an insight that you can see that all of society, when it works well, is modelled on the natural family. When you have society working like a family, you end up with something which is economically, socially very strong. When you have it organised in a different way, especially the conflict theory way, you find that things get nastier and nastier. You move into a dark age, basically. Unfortunately, what I'm just describing as things moving into a darker period is what happened with the guilds. I was talking about the way that, 12th century to the 14th century, everything was getting better and better and better all the time, right? But things got to be too good. By the time we get to the 15th century, so into the 1400s, the masters were becoming a bit greedy. They were living pretty well. They could see that they could sit back and set their own prices. But they started to have a problem. The problem worked like this. They were looking around and like, excuse me, I might have to start using a microphone shortly. I'm making my gloves. I can make a certain amount of money. Oh, you're very cool.
No, you're right.
This thing's gone off, has it?
It works, but the problem is it's so low it won't pick up the voice. I'm just trying to lift the table. There you go.
Good on you. That's what you'll do. Okay, very good. Where were we? 15th century, largely the masters abandoned the just price principle. Now, I've already talked about how the just price came about, but you can imagine that there's a lot of missed opportunities if you're organising yourself around the just price. The way it happened in places like England was that the masters started employing people who lived basically under the radar. And they did that by, if I was a glover, I would employ people off in some village somewhere. I would get them to make a lot of my gloves. They wouldn't have the supervision that they'd have working in my workshop. They wouldn't have the skill because they hadn't been fully trained. They weren't journeymen. They didn't have the kind of technology, whatever. But I would make sure that they could do a passable job, right? And, in the dead of night, they'd come down and deliver the gloves and what have you. And suddenly I had, 10 pairs of gloves available in my window. Now I had 20, right? And the other 10 had just come from this kind of scab labour, I guess you'd call it today. But I was kind of organising off-site. I was able to pay those people less because they weren't qualified. Okay, but their product appeared in my workshop under the seal, if you like, under the authority of being top quality product. Now, if I was able to buy it for less and sell it for the same amount, what's going to happen to my profit? Okay. These days, last 20 or 30 years, we've been doing that in Australia by simply taking something that was made in Australia, might be shoes, might be pens, might be transformers, might be you name it, and we're simply taking our production capacity and moving it off to some place in Asia, maybe China. Before that it was Korea or Japan. Okay, maybe there's the same quality. I mean, I'm still sort of a bit peeved with electric fans. On a warm night you sort of have a fan going. When I was your age, you'd buy a fan and it cost a bit of money. But my parents bought a fan once when I was about your age, and last time I saw it, it was still going. Okay, now you go down to Bunnings and buy yourself a room fan. They're sort of white. They cost $10 or something. 18 months later, you sort of put it out on the side of the road with the council cleaner. Yeah. Now what's happened? You see, we make a lot of money out of selling these things, but they're junk. And so much else of our society is junk. We're taught to believe that clothes should be thrown away, a season or two after you buy them. They're junk. Technology. You buy yourself a phone. Now, electronics is capable of being built very, very easily that will last literally for generations. Okay? But now even your iPhone, it looks really, really nice, but it's junk. You can't change the battery in it. It's expected to wear out before the battery wears out. 2 or 3 years and you get a new one. Junk. This was what sort of came in as an innovation in the 15th century. The masters basically lowered their production costs but continued their price, that basically the community was being ripped off by being sold junk. Wages went down, quality went down and so on. But we made a lot of profit, sorry. What that did, though, it transformed the family metaphor inside the guilds into a conflict theory model, something similar to what Marx would codify a few centuries later. Because if I was a journeyman and I came along to work for some master, the master would say, look, yeah, that's right, I've actually got enough journeymen right now. I've got sort of plenty of gloves in my window, and you look around and you think, oh, it doesn't look like you've got enough journeymen to actually make that many gloves. Yeah, don't worry about it, However, I'll let you work for me if you work sort of twice as many hours or what have you, or maybe work for a bit less pay, right? And the journeymen, now instead of seeing the masters more like a father figure, they're seeing them more like a slave driver. Marx actually had a few good points, right? Because this really did happen. It's a very sour and sad sort of thing that happened. Basically, the family metaphor that I was describing in the last slide was then transformed into this conflict metaphor that we now associate in industrial relations. On the public side, the guilds started to lose their credibility. If you bought my gloves, maybe on a good day you might catch the right pair that was actually made by a qualified person, but on a bad day you might pick up the one that was made by, Billy Bloggs kind of out in the never somewhere, that just looks like a reasonable pair, but the sewing's going to fall apart, or the thread that's being used is very poor quality and so on. Are you going to trust me? Now in this world, trusting me meant trusting the Guild of Glovers. So you have a completely different situation. Now what it means is that when you come to buy a pair of gloves, you don't simply come along to a guild master and buy a pair. You have to be able to spot a good pair from a bad pair. You can no longer trust the guilds. You have to waste an awful lot more time checking everything you buy. Is it a good pair of gloves? Is it a good pair of shoes? Is it a good sort of bolt of linen that you're buying to go and sort of, sew up your clothes with? You have to waste an awful lot of resources learning how to spot the quality in all these different trades, and then waste a whole lot of time actually going and doing that before you buy stuff. It'd be a bit like sort of going up to buy lunch today and then having to actually sort of sniff and test and do some sort of chemical analysis on the coffee to make sure that it's not made out of who knows what. Right? We've got to have a level of trust in the society, and that was lost through this period. However, the masters were able to make a lot of money. With the loss in public credibility, from about the 16th century onwards, the craft guilds started to be disbanded. There were laws and there was public movement, outcry against them. And so this institution that had made society a far easier place to live in and a far more comfortable place to live in had transformed itself into an entity which was seen as a public thief, exploiting its own people and exploiting the community. And the society basically said, we've had enough. However, a new commerce was now in place. A commerce where instead of trusting the provider, it was a place where the buyer must beware. Caveat emptor. What are we talking about? We're beginning of a new approach to commerce overall. A similar thing was happening in the finance industry. We mentioned usury before. We've already talked a little bit about it. The important thing about usury is that if I lend you money, I don't charge you money for borrowing it. No direct income on a money loan. The metaphysical origin of this belief is the fact that money itself is not productive. This is a foreign concept in our culture today because we think it is. You think, okay, I want to start a business. I might want to go out and I want to start work as a property developer or as a property valuer. Some of you might want to do that. What's the first thing you're going to do in order to set up shop as a valuation firm? You'd probably go down to the bank and get an overdraft because you probably need a few $100,000, $500,000, what have you, in order to run your business, because the money is necessary to run your business, isn't it? So in that sense, you say, well, what are you saying? Money's not productive. You can't run a business without money. Hang on. Think about it a little bit further. When you borrow that money, what's the first thing you do with it? If you want to set up business as a dairy farmer or as run a shoe shop or what have you, you get your loan from the bank. The first thing you do with that money is spend it. Okay? If I'm going to start a shoe shop, okay, I might get $1 million from somewhere and I'll pay some rent, put in some shop fittings and buy hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of stock. What's making my business? What's making my profit? Is it the money that I borrowed? or is it something else? It's the shoes, that's my stock, which is making the money. To a certain extent, it's the shop fittings. Maybe it's the money that I spend on advertising promotion. But it's not the money. And there's this distinction between money and the things that money will buy. Money itself is sterile. It doesn't produce anything. That's an insight that comes from Aristotle. Interest on money is in fact a second income, a second payment. If I lend you $100, the cost of the $100 to me is $100. Your obligation to me is $100. That obligation is there whether you give back to me tomorrow or next week or next year or in 5 or 10 years' time. Because that's the price, that's the value of $100. If you pay me interest or rent on that, what's actually happening is that you're paying me both the value of the money, which is $100, plus a second payment, which is the rent on the money. So it's a double income. There are a number of arguments. I won't go into too many of them at this point. The key thing is the last point on this slide, which is that the lender takes an income without any risk. If I start my shoe shop and I buy my shoes, I have the capacity to make profit, okay, largely because I've got to wait for people to come in and buy the shoes. Maybe the shoes might get old, maybe some of them might get mouldy or something. And so I'll have these risks involved. And also I'm going to be doing work. And it's the work and those risks which is really behind the profit I make in my shoe shop. A lender avoids all risk and all involvement in the productive activity. And so really they've got no call on the income. Okay, we won't take that any further, but it's a very interesting but largely forgotten element, moral element, ethical element in the economy. Overall effectiveness, I'll just finish this slide and then I think we might finish our class. Oh, hang on, no, I've got to go a bit further. Rats. Got to talk about the Muslims. Okay, let's just... we'll do a break. We really should do our debate. Yeah, let's take a break here. You can read what's on the slides there. Basically, at the year 1500, things were going pretty well, and by the time you go into modernity, I'll just do this slide, then we'll finish. Just do it quickly. Machiavelli, who was a writer around the year 1500. He lived in Florence. He wrote a book called The Prince, which is meant to be a workshop manual for monarchs. And he suggested this. Hence, a prince, in order to hold his position, must acquire the power to be not good, and understand when to use it and when to not use it in accord with necessity. Now, that's how it translates. Just give some thought to what that means. We previously had a situation where you went into the glover's shop and regardless of whether you understood what the glover was doing or not, you knew he was a good bloke. He was going to care for you. Machiavelli is basically telling the community that in order to be effective, you have to acquire the power to be not good. In other words, to be a bad bloke. Reading The Prince, the first time I read it, I thought it was a satire. I didn't think it was serious. Because it basically said how a prince should be a good person, be an honest person, but know when to use dishonesty. To be a kind person, but to know when to use cruelty. To be a person who honours his treaties, but know when to break them. And basically he went through every imaginable virtue. I think it's about chapter 14 and around that of The Prince. And it's bizarre. It's like sort of something out of a nightmare. Where where Machiavelli's recommendation to the prince is to look like a good bloke, but actually know when to be a bad bloke. Now that's exactly what the confidence trickster does. If I want to lie to you, I don't come here and sort of simply tell you rubbish beginning to end. Because you say, oh, it's small's out of his tree, right? If I want to tell you a really good lie, a nice juicy lie, I'll come in here and maybe rabbit on for half an hour telling you all perfectly true, interesting, insightful stuff. Then I'll slip in my lie. And maybe I might sort of sandwich it with a bit more true, insightful and interesting stuff, right? You might have come away with a bit of education, but you've also come away with my lie. And you'll be stupid enough to think, oh yeah, Small sort of always says all these interesting, insightful things. So you come away and I've got you. You could have found the true things that I've said to you somewhere else. But the lie, that's what's going to change your life. It's going to make me more comfortable because I'm going to rip you off in some way as a result of my lie. That's what the Prince is doing, and that's what Machiavelli suggested. Machiavelli has the title of being the father of modernity. When we talk about being modern, we're talking about being, if you like, the intellectual sons of Machiavelli. It means that we believe the ethic, the foundation for culture that Machiavelli gave us. The importance of appearing to be one thing while really being another. When we apply that to economic issues, it means that we change our property rights from ownership with obligation to being simple ownership, or what we know as freehold, and especially the loss of the commons. Around the time of Machiavelli, Henry VIII in England was the first monarch in 1,000 years to permit the charge of interest on a money loan. For 1,000 years before that, charging interest on a money loan was considered illegal and immoral. Henry VIII initiated legally acceptable 5% interest rate. Usury basically went down the tube. And profit maximisation became the mainspring of commerce. What do you call that system of commerce? Where you charge according to what the market will bear, you rely on finance to balance things up. Starts with a C, it's not communism. Yeah. This is the beginning of capitalism.